Good evening, everybody. We're ready to start. Okay, we're in Acts chapter 25. You all find that? Acts chapter 25. Yeah. Oh, here. Okay, we're all there. Right, I don't know if you remember last week we finished with Paul about to start 2 years of kind of house arrest, or so it seemed, as you look through those verses. If you look at chapter 24 and verse 23, it just says that it seems like Paul's got fairly he's in house arrest, he's got a little bit of room to manoeuvre almost. But then when you get to verse 27 where we finished last week, it says... Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favour, left Paul bound. I don't know whether it just means he was confined to a house or whether he was actually bound at this particular time. I don't know how we can elaborate on that from what we've got here, but whatever way you look at it, he certainly was restricted, wasn't he? And so it was for 2 years, which is quite a long time to be in that position. But we see in chapter 25, verse 1, we read this, look. Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So we've got a change here now, right? Felix, according to Josephus, was recalled to Rome. He'd settled a sort of like a civil rights dispute between Jews and Syrians in Caesarea in a rather harsh manner, and I think it caused a lot of trouble. And so he was called back to Rome to give an account of how he'd handled the situation. And so we see this new chap arrives on the scene to take up the role that has been vacated by him. Festus. Festus turns up, okay? And he doesn't leave much time. He gets straight on with, getting sorted into the job. He wants to go around, find out what's going on, what kind of situation he's inherited, what the problems are. And so we see that we're probably just in this handover period. Maybe, things are settled down a little bit from there anyhow. But Festus was very much like Pilate, okay? You'll see as we go through this, he makes use of the Herod, whichever the King Herod was at the time. Pilate sent his prisoner to Herod because he couldn't really make up his mind. And we see the same thing happen as we go through this story, that we've got two sort of Roman officials who really can't make their minds up. If you look at Pilate with Jesus, and then this case here with Paul, and they want information from the Herod, who's in power at the particular time. And it says, then the high priest, he goes down up to Jerusalem, look, from Caesarea to Jerusalem after he'd been there 3 days. And when he gets there, the high priest and the chief men of the Jews, they don't waste any time either. They're straight on to him, and they want to, get their point of view over straight away, As we see there, Felix is trying to size up the situation, get off to a good start. But the high priest and his supporters, they'd not forgotten Paul for one moment. We read in verse 2, then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favour against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem. That's talking about Paul, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. Okay, that sounds a bit familiar, really, doesn't it? Yeah. And the high priest and his supporters had not forgotten Paul for one moment. 2 years he's been sort of incarcerated in this house, and they're still festering away in their mind. Forget the pun, Festus and festering. But they're still going on in their mind, they're still worried about him, right? And they lose no time getting to Festus, and the plan is the same. It's going to be ambush and then kill Paul. Okay, well, we read about that a little while ago, don't we? I don't know whether it's the same group or not. We don't know whether they sort of have postponed their starving themselves to death because Paul was taken away by the Romans or not. But they may say, well, we've put that off, but let's get on with the plan again because we want to get rid of this chap. And so we looked at that before in Acts 23, didn't we? Verses 12 and verse 21, where these men had taken an oath that they would, they would die of starvation and thirst before letting Paul get away. But it must be... They're more, they could be very hungry and thirsty, I suppose, if it's the same people, but I doubt it. But verse 4, but Festus answers that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was going there shortly. So he doesn't fall for their plan straight away. Maybe he's been tipped off by his predecessor that there's been a little bit of upheaval and a bit of an upset there, and he needs to be a little bit cute and a little bit wise about what he does. And what we've actually got here in front of us, we've got this sort of situation that's going to bubble up really, and although in many ways not a lot happens, it actually is what causes Paul to appeal to Caesar to go to Rome. Okay, so he's boxed into a corner a little bit. So Festus stands firm. He doesn't give in to the priest's demands. As I say, he might have heard a little bit from Felix and the other advisors, but and anyhow, he says, "I'm going back to Caesarea myself. I'm going to go up there and I'll be with Paul. I can sort of, we can run an interrogation back there." So verse 5. Therefore, he said, "Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man and see if there is any fault with him. You can come along." He was determined to let justice take its course. He was a new official, and he wanted things to follow the correct way. And under Roman law, there are 3 stages that had to be followed for the law to be fulfilled properly. And I think he wanted to make sure that happened. And we see it does happen. The charges had to be formulated properly. You couldn't just come up with anything. And then they had to be supported by the prosecutor. You couldn't just come up with nonsense. The prosecutor had to look at it and say, "Oh, well, you have got something that can go ahead." There had to be a formal act of accusation before witnesses in the court, probably. And the case would then be held in the presence of the judicial administrator, often like someone like the procurator, like it was in the time of Jesus. It was Pontius Pilate. And here we have Festus in this particular case. And in this way, it means that the accuser came face to face with his accusers. They actually faced each other off. So let's just look at verses 6, 7 and 8. "And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought." So it's actually sort of like, it's like the courtroom, isn't it? He's got a judgment seat in there. That's where these sort of procedures took place. "And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself," that's Paul, "neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." So we see it's the same old story. The Jews come down with all their accusations, but they've got no proof of it whatsoever. So Paul, again, it's in court. He's been kept incarcerated for 2 years on trumped up charges. There's nothing really against him at all. It's quite hard, isn't it? Paul knew he was going to go to Jerusalem and face difficulties, but to be locked up like that for 2 years for nothing, I should imagine was quite frustrating, especially when he wanted to get to Rome. And we don't know what the serious charges were which they brought against Paul, what the Jews brought against him really. But I wrote that Paul says, there's 3 mentions: the law of the Jews, so I haven't sinned against that. I haven't done anything against the temple, and I haven't done anything against Caesar. So there's 3 areas that they were sort of, trying to sort of get him accused of infringing the laws. And the Jews knew that Paul couldn't be convicted on religious purposes alone. The Romans wouldn't convict Paul on infringements of the Jewish law, but if they could mention that he'd gone against Caesar, then there would be something to answer to. And this is like the first time we see that Paul's accused of going against Caesar here. And this is sort of quite pivotal, really, in this part of the story, really, because Caesar's come into it and the whole situation starts to change. Originally all these accusations against Paul were religious, but now this becomes a little bit more serious when you start to say that he's, gone against Caesar. That really ups the stakes a long way when you bring that into those accusations. And the reason that Paul was detained was not because of anything he'd done against the law, but because there was violence and there was an uproar in the crowd, and there was a civil disturbance. And that was that was an infringement of the Roman law in a way. Well, that wasn't his fault. He wasn't guilty of that, but that was why he was detained, for that and for his own safety, really, as a Roman citizen. We looked at that, didn't we, earlier? But the Romans had to deal with that situation. A little note I made here. Yeah, it's the mention of Caesar, because eventually we'll see as we get through this chapter, Paul is boxed into a corner by these accusations. Nobody seems to be listening to what he's got to say. And eventually he finds he's in a predicament where, if he goes up to Jerusalem and faces these accusations by the Jews, he's going to be found guilty one way or another. They'll get him. So he has to back off. So verses 9 and 12. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favour, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" Well, that's like sort of putting him in the hornet's nest, really, isn't it? It's chucking him to the dogs. So Paul said, "Look, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat," which is what he was doing. He was in that courtroom, and we just read that Festus had come to sit on the judgment seat. And that was like you were standing before Caesar in a way. It was his law. "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I'm an offender or I have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them." You haven't got the right to hand me over to them at all. And this is where everything changed. Look, I appeal to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, that was Paul's final appeal. I appeal to Caesar. And from the moment he does that, he's actually on his way to Rome. This is what Paul's been wanting to do. I don't think he ever envisioned himself going there as a prisoner to appeal directly to Caesar for his life, but he's going to go to Rome. And this is sort of like, you can talk about all of what we've been reading about Paul as, from the moment he was converted, getting him to Rome. And this is where it really sort of hinges here, right? I appeal to Caesar. So verses 9 to 12. For some reason, but maybe want to do the Jews a favour, Festus gave Paul that option, and that option was to go to Jerusalem. But Paul knew, as I said earlier, he hadn't got a chance there, right? And that was, to be tried before the Jews was absolutely, it was going to be totally sort of hopeless. So nothing prevented him, Festus, from using the Sanhedrin as sort of to give him advice about religious matters, about concerning the Jews. He was free to do that. For the Sanhedrin to act as his personal advisor, but Paul says, "I'm not going to have any of that. I'm not going down there with that." And that's his great worry, right? He could only get justice, he could only get acquittal under Roman law. He'd never get it under religious law with the Jews at all. He committed no offence against the Jews, and Festus knew that full well. And yet he's still saying, "I'll take you into Jerusalem. You stand before the Jewish council." So verses 10 and 11. So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be," right? I've read those ones, haven't I? Sorry, jumped out, right. I'll read them again, look. So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged, for to the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I'm an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver them to me. I appeal to Caesar." That is Paul's legal position. Okay? He's making it quite clear that's exactly where he stands. And he says, "If I've committed a capital offence, I'm willing to pay the price. If I've done it, but I know I haven't, and you know I haven't. I've not committed a crime against Rome, and I've not committed a crime against the Jewish religious laws at all. I'm perfectly innocent on all accounts." And he said, "In that case, not even you, Festus, can hand me over to the Jews to stand trial. You haven't got the right to do that, as I'm a Roman citizen." And so Paul's only got one option. And he took it. He takes that one option. And what is it we read there? "To Caesar you will go." That's where he's going to go. "I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, he speaks to the council, and he answered, "You've appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you will go." And that's it. Paul's really, he's not going to leave right away, but he's on his way. And then we get to verse 13. We'll go through this chapter. The thing is a lot of this, as we know, we've gone through it before, so maybe we just find something to chat about a little later. But this is the procedure that gets Paul to Rome, so it's important to read it. And verse 13. "And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus," all right? Now, this King Agrippa is the son of Herod Agrippa. And if you look into Acts 12, I think it is, that's the case where it says Herod, wanting to please the Jews, start to persecute the church. And he cut off the head of Andrew, wasn't it? John's brother Andrew, if I remember that right. I think it's Acts chapter 12, verse 1. I think he cuts off the head of Andrew. James, wouldn't it? It'd be James Boanerges, wouldn't it? James and John, wouldn't it? Yeah, James, yeah. He cuts off the head of James. Now, Bernice was his sister.
Mm-hmm. James.
Yeah, James. He cuts off James. That's that one, yeah. So he cuts off, Bernice is his sister. And there was a lot of controversy here because people tend to think that there was more to it than her just being his sister. And things were a little bit more sort of on the dodgy side than we would care to talk about tonight. But so there was some shenanigans going on there as well. Verses 14 to 21. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accuser face to face, and has an opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charges against him. Therefore, when they had come together, without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem, and there be judged according to these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar." So Festus tells Agrippa this story, and he tells him three things, right? In verse 15, he says he refuses to go along with what the Jews wanted. In verse 16, look, you read verses 15 and 16, the Jews make an accusation, and he says, I'm not going to go along with that. I refuse to go along with that. That's not the right way. Paul was not charged with what Festus expected him to be charged with. He thought it was going to be something against the Roman law, but it turned out to be religious, sort of arguments. So he said, I didn't expect that at all. And he said it was about a dead man who had been raised to life. And he said that's just, religious argument. And because Festus felt out of his depth on religious questions, he said, I asked that this could be tried in front of the Jewish council, that they would know more about these things. But Paul said no, he wanted to be tried in front of Caesar. He appealed to Caesar. And then verses 20 to 21, let's get through this if we can. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and be judged concerning these things. I read that 20, 21, yeah. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear the man myself tomorrow. He said, you shall hear him. So because Festus laid out such a sort of probably an interesting sort of sketch of all this history of Paul, Agrippa, his probably attention is grabbed as well. And he says, can I have a personal hearing with Paul myself? And so we get to verses 22 and 23. And 23. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, you can imagine them coming in splendour, and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. And this is probably the most elaborate of the 5 trials that we've got written of Paul in Acts. It goes on for a good few verses from here as well. But it's quite, sort of exact. And, it's well worth reading, really, for us, I suppose, to get a head around it. But we'll do that when we get into chapter 26 next week. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I have found he'd committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my lord concerning him. Therefore I brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I might have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. So Festus gives a bit of an account here, right? And there's a bit of truth and a bit misleading. There's a bit of untruth, I suppose, mixed in with it. It was true that the Jewish authorities had twice requested Paul's death. That was a fact. Yeah, that was right. And that Festus could find no fault, according to the law. He couldn't find a fault in him, according to the Roman law, anyhow. But what wasn't true is that Festus had got nothing definite to write about Paul, about the accusations, because what the Jews have accused Paul of was very clear. Their accusations against him were extremely clear. And, the fact that he couldn't specify charges against him. The Jewish charges, I say, they were really clear. What was missing was that there was any evidence against Paul. That's what he should have said. I'm lacking evidence against him. I've got the charges, but I've got nothing against this man whatsoever. And because of this lack of evidence, Festus should have said, and because of that, I want to set him free. But he never said that. As a Roman citizen, Paul should have been freed. And we've said that several times. So Festus also says this in verse 24, the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me. But the Sanhedrin was split, we know that. So that wasn't true either, was it? It wasn't the whole assembly of the Jews. Because the Pharisees said they could find no fault in this man at all. So we've got more mistruths as we get here. And I don't think we've got time to go into chapter 26 this week. That's a whole new story when we get into that. But there's a lot of stuff in here which is really sort of factual and maybe not a lot to sort of pull out for ourselves really as a way to live. But there are things in here. I've got a few questions if you haven't come up with anything that we could just mull over and talk about, just discuss. I wrote down one or two. You may have some yourself, but I've got a couple if you've got one. Anybody want to bring anything up about that? But we've got a little bit of time, haven't we, just to do that. But for the folks at home, we'll leave that there. It's a long chapter, but there's a lot in there for us to sort